The 2022 midterms have ended in a major disappointment for the Republican Party. There are many possible explanations that we can cover today, but the one factor that heavily contributed to this disappointment are young voters, many of which contributed to hindering the possibility of a red wave. In fact, since the Bush era, the GOP's main weakness has been pulling young voters into their electorate. Now, we are seeing the consequences of what happens when the GOP has continuously failed at appealing to young voters or even attempting to appeal to young voters. Looking at data, youth turnout in the 2022 midterms is the second highest in 3 decades, only behind the 2018 midterms, which ended up in a blue wave. Not to mention that 27% of young voters surveyed plan to vote, which are pretty historic margins. And if you're wondering by what margin young voters voted for Democrats, it was by 27 points in 2022, which makes it a 2-to-1 ratio. That said, there are a few ways to interpret this data. I personally would interpret this data simply as saying that the GOP needs to do a better job at appealing to young voters, and 2022 sends a clear message to party strategists that it's simply not enough to simply wait around and assume that young voters will become conservative when they're around 50 years old. The vote split hasn't always necessarily been the case for younger voters, but especially for Gen Z and millennials, we've seen a very consistent trend. 2018, voters under 30 helped deliver for Democrats. 2020, Trump lost because young voters cut into his margins. Now in 2022, where youth turnout was very high this election cycle, and what happened? The GOP underperformed. And it does not need to be the case. We can even compare this to other age groups. Republicans gained their standing among senior voters, among older voters, but continue to lose the vote with young voters over the years consistently. And that has caused them elections that were initially winnable in the first place. This is something that's especially seen in key swing states such as Pennsylvania, Georgia, and even in Sunbelt states such as Arizona and Nevada. Now the question is whether the Democrats have found a way to crack the young vote, or rather that even despite being disillusioned with Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, young voters still decide to vote against the GOP. Neither are good signs for the Republican Party. If the GOP wishes to win, or even lessen their margins among younger voters, they must first start by paying more attention to younger voters in the first place, and not disregarding the potential for value in this demographic group. What the GOP needs to do is to address issues that matter most to young voters, particularly climate change, abortion, as well as guns. From there, the GOP needs to do either one of two things. One, they prove that their plan of action is good enough to address these issues and they have good value. Number two, either that or the GOP must be prepared to concede ground on these issues. Simply put, the 2022 midterms have shown when you put all your focus into crime and the economy and seemingly nothing else, you can lose so many young voters. DeSantis did an excellent job in 2022 by proposing climate change legislation, a 15-week abortion ban, and a school safety bill. Although Ron DeSantis lost young voters, the margins were much closer and favorable for DeSantis, comparable to Republicans in other states. This shows that you do not need to switch positions, you do not need to have a new agenda, but rather you need reasonable solutions that take into account the concerns of Gen Z and millennials. If the GOP wishes to win in 2024, the GOP needs to take these issues into account and make the future strategies to better appeal to these types of voters.